So I've been asked to give a few remarks on how Sweden has handled the corona pandemic, especially out of from a constitutional law perspective. So as you all know, I think you're aware of that the Swedish government's way of handling the corona crisis has drawn a lot of international attention. I mean, Sweden has tried to limit the spread of the virus by means of recommendations, mainly. We have not seen any quarantines or curfews. And this is interesting because the recommendations are, of course, not legally binding. Our political leaders are appealing to our common sense, and they're urging everyone to be extremely careful and to take responsibility for themselves and for their relatives, and of course for society in general. And as a result, we haven't seen any total lockdowns in Sweden. The most restrictive measures taken thus far is the closing of the Swedish border and the closing of all care facilities for the elderly, so it's not allowed to visit these facilities. We also have a restriction on public gatherings. All public gatherings with 50 or more participants are forbidden, according to the law as it stands right now. Sweden stands out also because the schools have remained open. This is except for high schools and universities, which have shifted to online teaching. And those who can are recommended to work from home. And as a result of the upcoming summer holidays, new recommendations have been issued or put out by the authorities relating to domestic travels. So we are recommended not to travel more than 2 hours away from where we live. Again, this is a recommendation, and thus there is no restriction of the freedom of movement in a legal manner or in the legal way of analyzing this. So all in all, this means that life somehow continues more or less as usual. I do believe that this is a good thing for children and young adults, especially for their social, mental, emotional development. But of course, it's also being criticized, and we will come back to that when we wrap up. So what specific constitutional issues have arisen due to this response? Well, first, I think we have to remember that Sweden stands out comparatively in that we don't have a possibility to declare a state of emergency in peacetime. The Swedish constitution is totally silent on this particular matter. Instead, the Swedish approach is to provide delegations to the government and sub-delegations to the responsible governmental agencies in a variety of statutes. So this is called anticipatory statutorification, författningsberedskap in Swedish. And this also means, of course, and it puts a heavy burden on the legislator, and it takes time to get the legal framework in place in order to take necessary measures. This is partly because when recommendations and delegations turn out to be inadequate, the solution is to rely on the possibility of the parliament to pass laws quickly if needed. And there are certain mechanisms that allows for the legislative process to be speeded up in a way. And this possibility has been used, and we can see examples of it taking 2, 3, up to 10 days to amend a law in order for it to meet the demands that the particular crisis put. We call this constitutional readiness, and the ideology behind it, the philosophy behind it, is that we do not want a constitutional state of emergency in peacetime, since we can deal with it within the ordinary legislative procedure. And this has been the position thus far. I'm quite sure that the public debate will become more intense once the pandemic has settled down a little bit, and it's going to focus very much on whether this anticipatory statutorification and the constitutional readiness is sufficient to meet crises and pandemics like the one we are experiencing right now. Another Swedish particularity is that we don't have a ministerial government, as is common in many other states. So instead, the Swedish constitution stipulates that most of the government decisions are collective cabinet decisions, even if they are prepared within specific ministries. So this also means that individual ministers of government wield very little formal public power in relation to the governmental agencies that they are responsible for. So, and the central public administration is performed by semi-autonomous administrative agencies. They are semi-autonomous in the way that they have a duty to obey government directives if they are taken by collective decision making. However, these agencies have the constitutional protection when it comes to how they interpret and apply the law in individual cases. So Swedish administrative agencies are not exercising their powers per delegation from ministers of a particular ministerial department. They are acting independently, and we stand out comparatively in having this solution. It has created a situation where we have very strong governmental agencies. We rely on their expertise. We rely on them being not politicized and relying only on the expertise they wield within the field that they are responsible for. So thus, the governmental agencies responsible for the responses needed as a result of the corona pandemic, they have been up there on the podium every day explaining what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, and what the consequences are as a result. And this is also one of the explanations as to why it took longer for the Prime Minister and other ministers in Sweden to get out there, show leadership, political leadership, and be more visible in handling the situation. So you can summarize this as in Sweden we have a strong tradition of trusting in and relying on our administrative agencies, public agencies, mostly as a result of them not being politicized and as a result of the expertise that they have built up within their own organization. Well, although, we're all aware of the fact that the Swedish approach is being criticized both globally and in Sweden due to our relatively high death rates due to the corona. Still, there are a couple of aspects which I think is worth paying attention to as regards the Swedish approach. First, I think it's all about being in it for the long run. In other words, how do we create sustainable solutions that people are willing to abide by? And how do we create solutions or recommendations, guidelines for how to act, which are not threatening to undermine trust in the legal system, trust in the public authorities, etc., etc. So the Swedish approach, as I said, is relying on recommendations, on social distancing, etc. It has worked quite well. So most businesses are still up and running, although with a smaller turnover, of course. Kids are going to school, life pretty much continues. All of this maybe potentially means that the transition back to normal is going to be less painful. We have seen no large restrictions on individual rights and freedoms. In the few cases where the government has imposed restrictions, they are limited in time. with a clear deadline for when they are up for a review again. And moreover, all restrictions and measures have their basis in a specific statute that either delegates power to the government or relevant authorities within a limited field. So we do not have any broad emergency law that will allow for sweeping measures. And this is going to be very interesting when we have the opportunity to sit down and analyze the different legal regimes in the future when everything has settled down a little bit. But I do believe that the Swedish approach, and this is absolutely crucial, of course, in a rule of law state, is that all repressive measures are clearly defined, they are limited in scope, and they have a clear deadline. We can see when they are going to end or when they are up for renewal. So in conclusion, I'm sure there's going to be a renewed discussion of whether a constitutional state of emergency needs to be introduced into Swedish constitutional law in the future. As regards the present measures, it's far too early to say how successful Sweden's policies are and will be compared to this more strict legal measures taken by most other countries. And it's going to be very interesting to compare the outcome with, for example, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden, then, since we have many similarities, but also people tend to forget important differences when it comes to the constitutional legal setting, political culture, etc. It seems clear that there is a high level of compliance in Sweden with the soft recommendatory measures so far. Again, taking into consideration the high number of death rates in Sweden, I'm quite sure that this rightfully will be discussed and debated for a long time to come, whether it has been sufficient or not. And this connects back to maybe the overall question. I mean, in a pandemic, in a crisis, it's all about time. It's a matter of time. And without a doubt, the responses and measures to fight the pandemic have been slower in Sweden than in many other countries. And this is due both to our constitution and also, more importantly, to our political culture, I think. And I'm gonna leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to all the important comparative constitutional law analysis and conclusions that will come out of the dreadful situation that we all find ourselves in at the current time. Thank you.